Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with Hebrew University Professor Elie Podeh. Hi, Elie.
Hello, good afternoon.
Such a pleasure to have you. And as we're approaching 20 years to the unilateral pullout from Gaza, the disengagement as it's called, in August, and of course at the same time the IDF is launching a wide-scale operation in Gaza right now to seize and hold the territory, according to IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir. I'm here with Elie Podeh to discuss some of his most recent research looking into the disengagement and how it wasn't necessarily a unilateral pullout after all. So all of this and more after the break.
Jews have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. Thank you, Mr. President, for Jerusalem. No thank you for banning Arabs. His message on anti-Semitism is a good message. Trump is saying all the right things, and he may even be doing the right things, but for the wrong reasons. It's a dilemma for us, but I think we still have to stand up for the institutions, for due process, even if the wrong things that he's doing help us in the long term.
I just don't see how they help us at all, because I think in the long
run...
run...
There needs to be consequences. You can go out, you can march with a Palestinian flag, God bless you. That's fine. But if you use that flag to stop a Jewish students to go to class or beat them up, that's not freedom of speech. There needs to be consequences.
I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Hebrew University Professor Elie Podeh. Elie, thanks again for joining me. And we're here to discuss your new article, Israel's 2005 Disengagement from Gaza, a multilateral move under unilateral facade. I just want to read out something to our listeners that was published in 2004-2005, leading up to the disengagement. Israel has come to the conclusion that there is currently no reliable Palestinian partner with which it can make progress in bilateral peace process. Accordingly, it has developed a plan of unilateral disengagement. So this disengagement, Elie, describe a little bit for our listeners what led up to the disengagement, and then we'll delve into the idea that it wasn't necessarily so unilateral after all.
Hello, Amanda. Hello, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be here. 2 decades after the disengagement, it's very interesting to go back, especially with so much is happening in Gaza. And I think that at the beginning of the war, many people also asked, what was the purpose? And wasn't it a complete failure of the Gaza disengagement as a result of the 7th of October? So, coincidentally, I was interested in the subject, and the question is, to what extent could we find something new about the subject? I want the listener to remind that the information usually in the archive is revealed, declassified after 30 years. And we are already only 2 decades later. So interestingly enough, we find original material in the WikiLeaks documents, and also something which is called the Al Jazeera leaks. And these are original Palestinian documents that tell the story from a Palestinian point of view. So that is very interesting, because in such a way, you can look at what happened behind the scenes. And what happened behind the scenes, as you described it at the beginning, was that it was not actually a unilateral move. It was, by the way, a unilateral decision. That is true. But with regard to the implementation, how could you actually, in theory, implement it without someone else on the other side? So it also makes sense, but also the documents show that actually, when Sharon said that there is no reliable Palestinian partner, he obviously was referring to Yasser Arafat. But Yasser Arafat died in November 2004. And, the actual disengagement was in the summer of 2005. Already in January, Mahmoud Abbas became the president. So here we have a different partner. And he proved to be someone who was much more reliable. And, already in February 2005, Sharon met Abu Mazen and in Sharm el-Sheikh with Mubarak, and it was a very amicable meeting between the two. And even I would say that some trust developed between the two. And since then, the coordination began between the two sides.
So let's set the scene a little bit more. We're talking about 2004, 2005. That's when the whole process was really at least announced to the Israeli public and the world, of course. And this comes after years of the Second Intifada, in which, of course, the separation barrier was eventually built, which reduced drastically the number of suicide bombings and other attacks. And do you think that it was that planted the idea in Ariel Sharon's head, meaning this separation is working so well, maybe we should have another utter total separation from Gaza?
Yeah, I think that the historical context is very important because when Sharon was elected in 2003, he was under the pressure of the US American administration, as they say it, to rock the boat, to do something different. And more or less at that time, the Intifada ended somewhere in late 2004. And the idea with the decline or the end of the Intifada to do something new, to offer a new idea. And then Sharon came to the idea. By the way, it's very interesting to ask ourselves who initiated. I mean, who was the first one? Actually, I found six persons. Every one of them very much think that he was the originator of the plan. Something that has many fathers. I mean, in the past, we thought at least it succeeded very well. So many people thought they were the originator. Anyway, Sharon accepted it and he thought that this is something that we can work with. Now, his idea initially, at the time when Arafat was still alive, that indeed there was no Palestinian partner. And therefore, the main target was the US administration will do something in order to get something from the Americans. Not so much from the Palestinians, because as Sharon said, at that time there is no one to work with, but the Americans, they can give us something substantial. What was that something substantial? In April 2004, Sharon met with the US president, and he gave them a new letter of assurance that saying that the 1967 boundaries are not the final borders. So they will have to be amended. And Sharon presented it as a huge present by the US administration that was worth the disengagement. So that means that now in the West Bank we'll be able, I don't know whether to annex actually, but it means that we will be able to have the green light from the Americans to change the 67 border. And here, again, this is an interesting point because I took Sharon's, words as is. And when I interviewed the American ambassador, Daniel Kurtz, at that time, the ambassador here in Israel, he said, listen, there was nothing new in the American position. That was the American position since 67. So actually, it was presented as something new, but in many ways, it already presented the existing American position, although it was presented to the public differently. Obviously, you can understand what were the reasons behind that, to show that the disengagement brought a reward, and the reward was received from the Americans, not from the Palestinians.
It's so interesting what you're saying, especially if you add in the fact that, of course, the disengagement wasn't only from Gaza, but that there are also, I believe it was 4 West Bank settlements that had to be evacuated forcibly, very forcibly. No one can forget the pictures of the horses and et cetera, et cetera. And so it kind of sounds like his plan backfired, that Sharon's plan backfired, and that he was talking to his electorate. We're talking about Sharon, who grew up in Likud and then formed his own party, Kadima, to basically push this disengagement through. But this Kadima party was made up of such disparate voices, but included, of course, people from Likud who fled Likud or I don't know, moved from Likud at least in order to push this process through. And I think we need to add in another layer of context here, Elie, and that is, of course, the loss of life that was ongoing as long as Israeli settlements were in the Gaza Strip. Can you remind our listeners about the idea of how many soldiers' lives who were being lost during this very long time period in guarding these Israeli settlements? That was a very important factor, I think, for the Israeli public in supporting this move.
Yeah. Well, actually, this was when we asked ourselves what were the main reasons for holding the disengagement, apart from the fact that they said that they wanted to get something from the Americans. There were several reasons for that, and one of them was obviously the security issue. Sharon is considered to be the father of the settlements. And by the way, he played a crucial role back when we pulled out from Sinai and the agreement with Egypt. And then on that occasion, he pulled in a different direction. Obviously, he was trying to do something completely different. And by the way, there were other reasons that were mentioned. One of them was that he wanted to stay away from the corruption charges against him personally and other issues. And also, I might also mention the fact, I talked about, again, as I mentioned before, with the American ambassador, and they had many conversations. And I asked him, tell me what you felt about Sharon's decision. I mean, what did he think in his mind? And he said, listen, as I understood it, he changed his position. That was not the same Sharon. And he, in his mind, if successful, the disengagement would have been the first step in the implementation of maybe the roadmap, which was the American plan, which was initiated a year earlier, or something else. But the something else, in any case, was connected with the West Bank. And as you mentioned, the evacuation for settlements, I mean, the main reason was that it's the same logic of the Gaza and Jericho Agreement of 1994, to show to the Palestinians, and this is something that the American insisted, to show that the Palestinians that it's not Gaza first and Gaza last. It will be also later on, if implemented, if succeeded, it will continue in the West Bank. And this is a show of goodwill on your part, that indeed you are willing to do that. So that was the logic behind it. And you know what? I mean, we cannot know for sure what was going on Sharon's mind at that time. But I cannot rule out the possibility that this guy, this prime minister, who was the father of the settlement, he came to the conclusion that, in such a way, there is no way out of the conflict, and you have to think differently.
Okay, we're going to go to a short break and then discuss whether there could be a way out in our conflict right now.
What surprised you the most discovering about Jewish life in the United States?
I think it's the pride. I think I was envy of that pride. Just being proud, being a proud Jew. It's something that I never even contemplated. I was just an Israeli. I think the fact that, in Israel, we have all sort of sectors in society. You kind of grow up with your kind. I hate that. The fact that I don't know a lot about my Jewish life, and I need to go abroad just to understand that. It's something so messed up, and how we grew up here. It's just, I think, once it got political to be Jewish in Israel, it made me kind of push away from that. Once I got to LA, once I got just being with my daughters abroad, just understanding what we are, my heritage, where we come from, our story, our values. It took me a long time. It took me a long time to get there.
And we're back. I am Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Hebrew University Professor Elie Podeh. Elie, thank you again for joining me today. And so, as I mentioned at the top of the program, the Operation Gideon's Chariots is now underway, and the stated mission of this operation, at least part of it, is to seize and hold the Gaza Strip. Nobody in the IDF is talking about settlements at this point, but we can't deny that there are several ministers in the government that are definitely discussing settling Gaza again. So we were just discussing what led up to the disengagement. And here we are again in a bit of a plunter, as we say in Hebrew. We're in a situation in which there doesn't seem to be a way out, and that Israel feels very much alone, and definitely that it doesn't have partners in terms of the Palestinians. And one would argue that many feel there's no partner in terms of the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and even the United States occasionally is a little, people are skeptical about what's going on here. So Elie, in your article that you released rather recently, you talked about how the disengagement itself was a multilateral effort. And I wonder, I mean, we look to history in order to understand what's going on today. And I wonder if you see that there could be another multilateral effort, even as we're on the brink of again seizing the entire territory of the Gaza Strip.
A very important question. Well, first of all, let me say a few words about the multilateral nature of the disengagement, which is the crux or the main innovation in the article. What I was showing that since, let's say, February, but in particular April 2005, there was a beginning of coordination on the security level, on the economic level, and on the civilian level. So there were three committees, the Israeli and Palestinians, sometimes with the involvement of the Americans, that were trying to coordinate, all the many problems that were connected with the evacuation. There were so many open questions. First of all, what are you going to do with the settlements or some of the things that were left in the settlements? Secondly, what about the passages between Gaza, Israel, and also Rafah? Rafah was the most important one because that would have been the first international gateway for the Palestinians, for the Palestinian Authority. It was very important to show that they have an international border, and that would be Rafah. And that was the main problem between the two sides, and eventually it took a few months, but they arrived at some conclusion with the EU operating the passages, but the sovereignty is a Palestinian one. A very complicated arrangement that worked very well, by the way, at the beginning. In addition, you have the problem of a seaport. What they wanted to have a port. They wanted to have an airport also. As they said, the Palestinian, in the many conversations that they have, we don't want Gaza to be the biggest prison in the world. That is a quotation that, was repeated time and again, because for them, it was quite evident that if Israel is in charge of everything, that it means that they haven't gained anything substantial from the disengagement. And this is just to show to what extent was, let's say, the negotiations even, but all of them or most of them were held behind the scenes. And the two sides, and this is also interesting, they kept promoting the idea of, it's a disengagement because of, I think, mainly of the domestic public opinion. It was more convenient to portray the evacuation as something that was done unilaterally. And from a Palestinian point of view, it was also a big mistake because in such a way they couldn't show to their people that, it's a big gain. It's a political gain. And for Sharon, he didn't want to show the people, that the Palestinian gained something from the Intifada. This is how the historical context is important because it was immediately after the Intifada. So they didn't get anything in reward. we got something from the Americans, but the Palestinians, they didn't get it. We gained it because from a security and a community and so on, we gained a lot. So in such a way, the domestic circumstances, they, to a large extent, they dictate your policy on both sides. And this is, by the way, the situation till today, right? I mean,
of course. I want to just ask you something. The fact that Sharon refused to give the Palestinians any kind of credit in this, do you think, I'm talking about the Palestinian Authority, right? Do you think that that contributed to Hamas eventually winning the power in the Gaza Strip, meaning nobody thought that the Palestinian Authority had any strength. They were given no credit for the liberation of Gaza, shall we say. And so then this terrorist organization, Hamas, took control of the Gaza Strip, and everyone today knows what happened after that. So do you think, had it been different, had Palestinians gotten the credit, do you think we would have been in the mess that we're in today?
Yeah. Let's separate between, and these are two questions which are very important. What would have happened, obviously, we can't know. But what I know that it was a mistake on both sides not to give credit to the PA. They should have given the credit. And no doubt the Hamas gained a lot from it because you know what? His propaganda was very clear. Israel retracted, withdrew from the Gaza because of our terrorist attack. And by the way, they continued throughout the period. That was the main problem because Abu Mazen, and that was his own mistake, he arrived as a ceasefire at the Hudna with Hamas, something in March 2005. And he saw that, by the way, he perhaps, he solved the problem on his side. No, but maybe Hamas, they lowered the numbers of the terrorist attacks, but they continued. So in such a way, they could portray, and they did portray, the disengagement as a Hamas victory. And no doubt, we cannot weigh, we cannot measure the exact contribution, but I can assess that it very much contributed to their success. Had it been different, this is an open question, because first of all, they won the elections to the parliament. That was in January 2006. And then the takeover, which was in the summer the year after. So there is, all the events are too close to one another, and probably one affected the other, no doubt.
I have another coulda, woulda, shoulda question for you, which is terrible. But the question is, obviously, while the disengagement was being discussed and even immediately afterward, the rhetoric on the Israeli side was, even from the first rocket, we are going to pound the Gaza Strip tenfold, or things of that nature. I don't have the exact quote in front of me. And yet it appears in hindsight that Israel didn't really follow up on that promise. Would you agree with that? You
mean that we didn't retaliate immediately to every attack? Yeah, sure. I mean, this is a question that, first of all, has to be answered by people who, something about security, and to what extent it is possible, to what extent it will prevent the next round. Because we here see a pattern that repeats itself, and we can't know. Therefore, I'm very hesitant, to say something in this regard, whether it's positive or negative. What I do know, if we look backwards, that more could have been done with the disengagement. That's one of the issues that, first of all, the idea was to try and modify, to amend, to correct, history, to give more information, and to show that, as always, it was more complicated when you see what happened behind the scene. And secondly, that we are making mistakes on both sides, by the way. It's not that I'm blaming one side. I'm saying that everyone comes to the conflict with his own agenda and with his own reason for doing that or this. And the idea is mainly not to serve the other party, but to serve ourselves and our motivation and so on. But in hindsight, You look backwards and you can say, yeah, it was a mistake. Listen, on the same pattern, people can say, listen, after the 7th of October, in hindsight, the whole pull-out from Gaza was a mistake. But on the other hand, you had at that time something like 8,000 settlers in the Gaza Strip. What would have happened, since Hamas takeover in 2007? Try to imagine that, might it have been a kind of 7th October? I don't know. But one thing led to the other. And the only thing that we can ask ourselves at a certain point, how this event was implemented, was carried out, and could it have been different? And yeah, that's my answer, that it could have been different. And this is something that, by the way, I'm saying about many of the events between the two parties, You look at the Oslo Accords, you can plainly and say, listen, it was a mistake. But on the other hand, you could say, listen, the Oslo agreements, the way they were carried out, implemented, they affected very much the outcome. The problem not necessarily was the agreement as its implementation on both sides. This is part of the conflict, by the way. The conflict about the conflict, or how we solve, or how we get to the conflict. I think that the situation today after the 7th of October is much more complicated. And this is maybe an answer to an earlier question, but this will be a big mistake to return to Gaza. This is something that we have to take, from previous history, whether we go back to the disengagement or even earlier. That will obviously incite, reignite the conflict, specifically in Gaza and elsewhere, no doubt. We have to remember that, according to the numbers that I have, approximately 120,000 Palestinians left Gaza voluntarily. Okay, so let's say more or less these are the numbers.
What period of time?
From the 7th of October.
Okay.
We are still roughly talking about 2 million people that live in Gaza. And if anyone is interested, by the way, in 1948, there were between 60 and 70,000 Palestinians in Gaza. That's all. So in addition, after the war, roughly another 160,000 were added to the number. Okay, so mostly were refugees. And since then, they, increased to tenfold since 48, more or less. This is the situation. And it will remain so in terms of demography. So even though we are talking about immigration, and even if it's voluntary immigration, we are generally talking about not big numbers, and the situation, I don't believe, can change dramatically. So in any case, do we want to go back there? Do we want to have another military administration controlling and in charge of whatever, all the domestic affairs, of course? Obviously not. I guess so. It doesn't make any sense. So therefore, whatever will happen, not to enter or not to remain in Gaza no longer, and certainly not to settle in Gaza. It has to be part of an overall agreement about the Palestinian issue. That should be the issue. I know that we are very much far from it right now, but we do have to understand that Gaza is part of a larger problem or a larger conflict that has to be settled. And this, in my mind, has to be connected to the bigger issue, which is the regional context, and this is the Saudi issue or the Saudi normalization. That's the only avenue that we should go, in my mind at least.
Okay, a final question before I let you go. And again, thank you so much for your time. In your article that you published, you talked about the multilateral effort, and the partners were the US, it was Egypt, it was the Palestinian Authority, and was it not Jordan as well? Did you discuss Jordan? Right.
Yes.
Partly Jordan. And so I'm looking at the region right now as we have it right now during the war. And obviously the idea of disengagement, if you take your mind back to it, the Arab world was overjoyed with the disengagement from Gaza. It was considered a good first step, obviously, and, the rest of Israel after that. But in any case, do you think that these partners or others can come together today in order to facilitate any kind of ceasefire or Israel withdrawing from the Gaza Strip, even as, of course, as I said, we're on the brink of seizing and controlling the Gaza Strip this week. So do you see that there is this goodwill, even back channel goodwill among these partners or others?
Yes, for sure. And I think that we see it now, we saw it along the war. I mean, if Israel will do anything on the Palestinian front, it will find quite a few Arab partners that are willing to cooperate and are willing to reciprocate. And that is very important. By the way, Sharon, after the disengagement, he was received with such enthusiasm when he came to the UN as, he had a very negative image, including in the Arab world, by the way. And he improved his image and Israel's image tremendously. So that was a big change. And right now, it seems if you go, I'm following what is going on in the Arab world, particularly in Saudi Arabia, but not only. And we see that all of the countries, and the last Arab summit in Baghdad, before that it was in Cairo, before that it was in Riyadh, all of them, say more or less the same thing. First of all, end the war. Secondly, find some solution. Some of them don't even talk about a Palestinian state. They are willing to settle for less than that. What will be the modalities? What will be the exact details? This is remain to be seen. But you now have, in general, an ally in the US, President Trump, who will be obviously very much happy to guide even any plan, to settle the issue. So yeah, Israel changed its position before the 7th of October tremendously. We all remember the Abraham Accord, right? And you know what? It seems that Saudi Arabia was on the verge of normalization, even without a Palestinian state, but that was before the 7th of October. So indeed, Israel's position changed dramatically following the Abraham Accord. And then came the war. Now we have to see how we can unroll, the situation. And the first thing is obviously to end the war, to release the hostages, and then to move forward. But it has to come from a conviction on both sides, by the way. Whatever I'm saying, it is true on the Palestinian side, because I don't find now the right leadership that is willing to move forward. So it has to have the conviction on both sides, leadership and societies, that the 7th of October changed something here, and that we are more aware of how crucial is the Palestinian issue, because the Abraham Accord was a very positive thing, but what they did, they bypassed the Palestinian issue. And in many ways, that was one of the reasons to the attack. By the way, this is what Hamas and what Iran are saying, that was one of the reasons to the attack. And in that respect, they succeeded, by the way. It's, it's annoying, maybe, and regretful to say that, but they succeeded, like the Intifada, to raise the awareness. They put the Palestinian issue back on the international table, on the international agenda. And we have somehow to address it. We have to face it.
Elie, thank you so much for your time. Much food for thought. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week. Shalom.